Well, good evening, everybody from Southwest France. Maybe you'd like to put in the chat box where you're listening from, because I know we've got people really from all around the world, and then we'll see where people are coming from. This evening, we're very lucky to have Rupert Sheldrake with us, an honorary member of the network, to chair this evening's meeting and also to enter into dialogue with Craig. And we're very, very pleased to have Craig here from California, and as yet unharmed by any wildfires, I'm glad to say. But he said that you're just explaining before the call that there were a huge number of new wildfires created in very dry August by lightning. Anyway, it's a different kind of lightning that we're dealing with this evening. It's certainly a flashpoint. And on that note, I'll hand over to Rupert. And Rupert, you're extremely welcome. Thank you so much for coming along this evening.
Thank you, David. It's a great pleasure to be here with Craig Weiler. I met Craig only once when I was in San Francisco, must have been about 6 years ago. And I'm a great admirer of what he's been doing. He's a unique figure. He's independent. That gives him a great strength. He's not beholden to any institution or academic endeavor. He can speak his mind. And he has a kind of warrior spirit. His book is called Psi Wars. It is about a war. It's about a paradigm war that's going on. All of us in the scientific and medical network are only too aware of this war. The defenders of the materialist paradigm, they don't usually have to defend it. They take it for granted, and in most educational institutions, it's taken for granted. But on the front lines of the battle, when it's challenged, they have a kind of the shock troops of the materialist world, the so-called skeptics, the people who belong to skeptic organizations, not, of course, genuine skeptics who really want to learn more about truth through the method of doubt, but essentially denialists who oppose anything to do with psychic phenomena, holistic worldviews, alternative medicine, etc. They've done a great deal of damage over the years by maintaining and constantly fighting to maintain this paradigm. At present, they're most successful in Wikipedia, where they've captured large numbers of pages to do with alternative medicine, psychic research, and biographies of people like me. What Craig has done has documented these controversies, a bit like a war correspondent in the Psi Wars. You know, like war correspondents go to places like Baghdad and Tripoli, where the action is. Craig has been there. And during the controversy that followed the banning or the taking down from the website of my TEDx talk, Craig was right there where the action was, documenting what was happening day by day, and has a better overview of these conflicts as they actually unfold on the internet, which is where they're mainly happening now, than anyone else. And he's documented this in his book, Psi Wars, which has just come out in the 2nd edition. And I strongly recommend it because it's an eyewitness account of the front line. And there's something in it that all of us need to know. And we need to know how these so-called skeptics work, where they're coming from, what their attitudes are, and what can affect what they're doing. And so this is not just an academic look at something in the history of controversy. This is something that's relevant to what's happening now, to the ongoing battles of in which we're all involved. So I'm very pleased that Craig is here, and he just told me that this is the first time he's done a serious major presentation on this book. So welcome, Craig, and I'm very glad you can be doing this with the Scientific and Medical Network. Over to you.
Thank you, Rupert. It's a pleasure to be here. And without further ado, I will simply launch into my presentation. So here we go. Once upon a time, there was a paranormal investigation conducted by two experienced researchers. And as they were finishing up, a skeptic walked in and politely asked to go over what they had discovered. The two researchers agreed and proceeded to walk the skeptic through all the things that they had done to ensure that their research was sound. The skeptic pored over the details, examining them at length, and finally, after a long time of thoughtful study, the skeptic turned to the researchers, adjusted his glasses, and gave his opinion. "I can find nothing wrong, and I have complete respect for the both of you," he said. "You are far more expert in this than I am, and I trust your judgment. As far as I'm concerned, you've both done remarkable research, and in fact, it is so good that in combination with all the other paranormal research that I have studied, I am convinced that these phenomena are real, and they all celebrated and lived happily ever after. The end." Just kidding. If you found that funny, it's because this little story subverts everything we know about skeptics. The skeptics found nothing wrong. He has respect for the researchers. He trusts their judgment. That's freaking hilarious. The expectation, of course, is that the skeptic will always find something wrong and will have no respect whatsoever for the researchers. This is the archetype of the skeptic and also the belief system woven into Western culture. The intellectually superior skeptic, a calm, level-headed, and objective person, is constantly battling superstitious nonsense and irrational beliefs. In contrast, the archetype for the paranormal researcher is that they are always incompetent and their research shoddy. They are well-meaning, bumbling fools so caught up in their own beliefs that they are blind to the flaws in their own studies. But they keep trying, and only the greater intellect of the skeptic keeps their foolishness at bay. I remember when I saw this play out in a rather obscure movie called Red Lights. In one scene, a parapsychologist eagerly runs up to a skeptic to show her his latest study, and she shoots it down in an instant with a keen observation of an obvious flaw. That scene was such a complete work of fantasy that unicorns and fairies would not have been out of place. The reality is that while most parapsychologists, who are almost universally better at science than their skeptics, will publicly comment on the importance of skeptics in parapsychological research, however, in private, many consider these people to be no better than your average internet troll. Intellectuals and even former skeptics have been commenting on the problem of parapsychology skeptics for decades. Rupert Sheldrake, of course, has created the website Skeptical About Skeptics to catalog all of these efforts. So before I go any further, let me tell you something about myself, since my fame level is about equal to the people I'm talking to. I'm not an academic, but I prefer to know all the details, and I like the careful way academics present their detailed arguments. Professionally, I'm a general building contractor, and I have a BA in Spanish from UC Berkeley. I was also a foreign exchange student in both Mexico and Germany as a young man, and later I helped teach students who were about to embark upon their foreign exchange about dealing with other cultures. I have a lot of experience in recognizing when someone is caught up in their own values, attitudes, ideas, and beliefs. As a young man, I was involved in the New Age movement. I took classes from psychics, I tried out psychic healing, and even participated in New Age fairs, and I taught some classes myself. I have always had a deep connection to the spiritual, so much so that I rarely give it much thought. It's just there for me when I need it, like a toaster. I got involved in parapsychology around 2008, and the careful way science intersected with the ambiguous nature of psychic ability was fascinating to me, and I was immediately hooked. It's now an avocation for me, and it's what I write about in my spare time. At work, it's my job to be decisive and to take action. I find that this trait tends to set me apart from more academic looks at parapsychology. For me, skeptics have a duty to be well-informed, to adhere to objectivity. Otherwise, they have no business having opinions on parapsychology. If I want to listen to the opinions of people who have no idea what they're talking about, I can always attend a large family gathering and wait until the effects of alcohol set in. Like most business people, I have to make a lot of decisions, and I don't fret over them. I don't need to know everything because in the real world, that's neither practical nor attainable. I just need to know enough. And the scientific evidence for psychic ability certainly meets the standards of enough. So I checked that box and I moved on. Here's why I think we have enough evidence. According to polls, roughly half the world has had some sort of a psychic experience. Stories of psychics could be found in every culture as far back as you care to go. And if you're looking on the internet, you can find thousands and thousands of stories of psychic experiences and experiences with psychics. There are working psychics all over the world, with a few contributing to some areas such as police work and archaeology. There is scientific literature dating back almost 150 years of investigative reports. There are over 60 years of lab experiments confirming the existence of psychic ability. In the present day, we have the Ganzfeld telepathy experiments with thousands of trials conducted by over 50 different researchers. It has 6 different meta-analyses, intense scrutiny, and all of this points to the existence of telepathy. We have replicated studies on the effects of being stared at, replicated studies on psychokinesis, on mediumship, replicated studies on precognition, replicated Reiki studies, and a 20-year remote viewing program that the government found useful. We have a massive amount of evidence for reincarnation and a decent amount of evidence for out-of-body experience. There are dowsers that make a good living. And then there are other experiments, autistic children who have demonstrated near-perfect telepathy, experiments with lab mice demonstrating successful psychic healing of a normal fatal cancer. I could go on. The body of scientific evidence supporting psychic ability is formidable. And if we take a step back and we look at the big picture, what we discover is that parapsychologists have tested for something that, based on real-world observations, they should find. It should be no surprise whatsoever that psi experiments have yielded positive results, because this confirms something that has been nearly universally observed. In the field of parapsychology, the evidence is overwhelming enough that psi researchers stopped working on evidence for psychic ability and started to understand it better. From their point, and all of this is naturally at odds with what we constantly hear from skeptics. From their point of view, all of that evidence is flawed. All of it, 100%, no exceptions. All those 3 billion people just fooling themselves. All the psychics and mediums are frauds, fakes, and fools. All the investigators throughout the last century were misguided and missing important flaws, and all of the lab experiments were failures. I can't take this skeptical position seriously. There's clearly something wrong with it, but I can see why this persists. The reason for this absolutism, the reason that this absolutism has gone mostly unnoticed is that most people only ever see just a little piece of it. Taken in small bites, it looks like reasonable arguments from reasonable people. It's only when you see it over and over and over again that you begin to realize what Nobel Prize-winning physicist Brian Josephson recognized plainly decades ago. It's pathological disbelief. If you know what to look for, this is immediately obvious. The skepticism never comes with helpful suggestions for further research, and the aim is always to discredit that research and the scientists along with it. Here's a good example of how that works. I remember when Professor Daryl Bem got his precognition research published in the highly respected Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. That was in 2011. This was a high watermark for parapsychology, so naturally there would be a hostile skeptical response. It wasn't a question of if, but when. Unlike other parapsychology experiments, it was impossible to quibble over the study design because that had been vetted. That same year, Wagenmaker and others published a Bayesian analysis of the study, which found no effect. Of course, they set their prior probability of psychic ability to an infinitesimally small number, and the size of the effect to be quite large. So that statistical analysis began with the premise that psychic ability was effectively impossible, but if it were true, we'd see people with near superpowers. Unsurprisingly, the statistics gave him the numbers he was looking for. Wagenmaker went on to the conclusion that since psychic ability couldn't be real, but the study clearly showed it was, that psychology must be broken. It was about a year before it all made the news again. Skeptics Richard Wiseman, Chris French, and Stuart Ritchie ran 3 studies and eventually published them on PLOS One. They announced to the world that they had failed to replicate via an article in The Guardian and other places. What they didn't mention, and what no one checked up on, was that they failed to include 3 other studies, 2 of which were positive. They also failed to include a literature review. The story that got out to the world, the one that made the news, was a failure to replicate. No one paid attention to the details. So now we fast forward to 4 years later, and it's 2016, and 90 replications of the study have been done. This isn't widely publicized, but among scientists, the information slowly got out. And then we jump a year more, and it's 2017, and the skeptics, with their backs against the wall because it's a solid study and plenty of replications, rehash the idea that science is broken. Throwing out an entire field of science to make one positive result go away seems reasonable to them. If denial was a superpower, these guys would be full members of the Justice League. This whole soap opera took place over the course of 6 years, broken up into little bits that the public and the greater scientific community rarely read about. It's only after the fact, when the whole thing gets gathered up and put into context, that you can see what's really going on. Otherwise, it just looks like more parapsychology controversy with muddled results. And what happened with Ben's experiment is just another Tuesday in parapsychology. If it was discussed all the time and everybody got a good look at how skeptics view everything psi-related, the skeptical absolutism would be exposed, and they would rapidly lose credibility. But the very occasional drip, drip, drip of news essentially gives the skeptics a fresh start every time. Now, there was that one time when yet another parapsychology soap opera played out, but this time the skeptics were forced into constant dialogue with psi advocates. The skeptics have done such a good job of selling their viewpoint that the nonprofit media corporation TED Talks makes decisions based on their advice. Most people have heard of TED Talks. They're known for their highly polished 20-minute video presentations on a variety of interesting topics. Our story takes place in 2013 when Rupert Sheldrake, who needs no introduction, and archaeologist Graham Hancock gave speeches at the TED affiliate TEDx Whitechapel. The backstory here is that the staff at TED Talks maintained friendly relations with various skeptics, notably Jerry Coyne, P.Z. Myers, and they also listened to skeptic Reddit threads and heeded their advice. Based upon their complaints, TED decided to take action and remove 2 videos from their main website. Neither Sheldrake nor Hancock are mainstream, which is why this happened. The good folks at TED assumed that they were listening to scientifically minded people who had examined the evidence, not a bunch of fanatical lunatics. The gory details of what happened at TED are complicated and the subject of my book. What I'll say here is that it was a direct clash between skeptics and advocates of psi. There is a story here of a science controversy, but it's also very much about the nature of the skepticism as well. It's worth noting that Sheldrake's video started out with a respectable 35,000 views at the time, but eventually reached 5 million people as a banned TED Talk. Hancock's video did similarly well, and both of them were vaunted into higher public awareness. I'm guessing that the TED curators imagined that the skeptics would make short work of the alleged pseudoscientists Sheldrake and Hancock, and they allowed for an open discussion on their site. They are to be commended for this. The sheer volume of opposition that they encountered seemed to surprise them. They were getting upwards of 1,000 comments on practically every thread they opened. But I'm sure that they were far more surprised at just how badly the skepticism held up in open discussions. Their community of skeptics wasn't helpful and tended towards insults. Both Sheldrake and Hancock requested the opportunity to debate TED's science board, a challenge that went unanswered. A lot of very respected intellectuals joined the discussion, including Brian Josephson, Deepak Chopra, and Charles Eisenstein, pretty much all in defense of Sheldrake. I think that TED was hoping to crowdsource their skepticism to help out with their obviously overmatched science panel. That science panel, by the way, did such an objectively terrible job of critiquing the videos that TED was forced to withdraw those critiques. Unable to come up with any good reason, but unwilling to back down, after about a month and a half, they settled for just taking down the videos, keeping them off their main site, and declaring victory. Because the TED motto is ideas worth sharing, the irony reached the level of a Monty Python sketch. They also took down TEDx Hollywood, so shout out to Suzanne Taylor, who's watching this, but I was not able to cover that in this time. It took about a year for the whole thing to die down, and the controversy probably took some of the shine off of TED in the process. The skeptical belief system plays well in academia and in most science media, but the general public doesn't like it at all. What happened on TED's website is what always happens when skeptics are forced to fight fair. They lose badly. That's a big reason why they don't fight fair. They can't. Because the curators at the TED Talks were listening solely to the skeptics, it was clear, at least to me, that they were getting really bad advice. It looked like TED was constantly getting pushed into condemning the talks, and this is what changed the controversy from a minor dust-up into a full-blown debacle. As a private company, TED had nothing to lose from simply giving in to public opinion, putting the videos back up and calling it a day. That would have been the sanest business decision. But they so firmly believed in the rightness of their skeptical position that they just couldn't let it go. So they kept trying and trying, allowing the controversy to build into something bigger and bigger until finally it got completely out of hand. And now they're stuck with negative publicity that they can never get rid of. These parapsychology controversies don't just play out on the big stages. They're mirrored on the smallest of them, with pretty much the same results. I'll use my own journey into parapsychology because it's a common one for people who get past the initial skeptical storm. My research into parapsychology wasn't just a personal discovery of a field of science that was exciting to me, but also an introduction to a brand of fundamentalism I'd never seen before. And that didn't register at first. I could wrap my head around religious fundamentalism and political fundamentalism, but science fundamentalism? That was so far out of my realm of experience that even though it was right in front of me, it took a while to comprehend what I was seeing. The promise of skepticism is that it's supposed to be an objective review, free from bias, coming from someone who's knowledgeable. Instead, the skepticism came with a sneering arrogance, crappy, uninformed talking points, which you've all heard. There is no evidence for psi, no evidence for psychic ability. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and no one has ever claimed the $1 million from the paranormal challenge. If you hear them enough, they start to sound like a prayer to the flying spaghetti monster. And a dive into skeptical academic papers doesn't improve the situation, but they do use bigger words. So there's that. Here's an example. One of the skeptics' favorite fake problems is the accusation of selective reporting, better known as the file drawer effect. That's where you have a bunch of unpublished studies that, had they been counted, would have changed the outcome. It's been leveled at psychokinesis experiments, despite the fact that it would have been basically impossible, both because of a pre-registration policy, but also because it would have required about 10 years of unreported studies in a tiny science field where everybody knows each other's business. Another skeptical fake problem was the lack of homogeneous results. They use that $10 word because complaining that some people are better at a task than others doesn't sound quite so impressive. And this nonsense was in a peer-reviewed academic journal. I've seen some papers that were even written in that sneering, angry, arrogant voice that skeptics are so fond of. The most impressive thing you could say about these skeptics was that they actually read the research they were criticizing. When compared to a lot of other skeptics, that's apparently an amazing feat. On a personal level, I was having arguments with garden variety skeptics, and as my knowledge grew, theirs didn't. They hadn't done any research. I'm used to running into people with no knowledge and strong opinions, but this was incredibly consistent. Before long, I'd come to associate skepticism with arrogance, rudeness, and most importantly, ignorance. It's almost always the same nonsense. I'm not credible, my sources aren't credible, I'm obviously a gullible fool, and my intellect is impaired. Meanwhile, the first page of their 10-second Google search is perfectly credible, and they are always 100% right. That gets old really fast. I'm not alone. People advocating for a wide variety of controversial topics have noticed this behavior and commented on it. Your average skeptic can point to something another skeptic has said, but will have no idea how to prove that that skeptic's argument has merit. They ignore any really good arguments and just get back to their talking points. It's repetitive and boring. For a bunch of people who claim to love science, they are about as convincing as a flat earther in space. The question here is, what on earth is going on with the skepticism of psychic ability that makes it so batshit crazy? You can't explain it as a scientific disagreement when science is hand-waved away. The best way to explain it is with an example from a specific political protest, because you can find many of the same behavioral traits displayed in that controversy. Now, in this case, the blowhard behavior is coming from hardcore conservatives, but this isn't a political rant. I'm only picking that example because the facts of it are very well known. In 2016, a Black professional American football player by the name of Colin Kaepernick kneeled for the national anthem at a football game. And he did this in protest of police brutality against Black people in the United States. He was very clear about what he was doing and why he was doing it. This produced a predictable outrage from the hardcore conservatives, but what I want to direct your attention to is how they expressed that outrage. They accused Kaepernick of being unpatriotic and un-American. Kneeling was supposedly an insult to the flag, and the most important part of this was that they couldn't be persuaded otherwise, no matter how much the truth was explained to them. They accused him of being a terrible player, that nobody wanted on their team, that he was a bad person, that the military was offended, that sports are not for protest, and that he needed to clean up his image. None of this was true, but that didn't stop the misinformation from getting repeated ad nauseum. There was no room for a reasonable discussion of the facts because one side had already decided that the only facts they would listen to came from their tribe. Everyone else was either crazy or deluded. It struck me as nearly identical to the kind of resistance I see to evidence for psychic ability, right down to being highly selective about the sources and being openly critical of everyone else. These hardcore conservatives, and by the way, very liberal skeptics, have some common behavior patterns that are quite noticeable. In both cases, strong pre-existing beliefs are clouding their ability to think clearly when it comes to certain subjects. This and other indicators they share are generally described as authoritarian. One thing that's almost never discussed, but is very important to understanding parapsychology skepticism, is that they're atheists. The self-described skeptics of the paranormal, the active one, all atheists. once you get that, you can begin to understand where the skeptics are coming from. Whatever diversity skeptics have, this is something they have in common. And they also embrace materialism as their science philosophy. And that's another part of the puzzle. Put atheism and materialism together, and you have a belief system when we are all familiar with how far some people will go to defend their beliefs. Skeptical witch hunter James Randi, who is known for his obnoxious attacks on psychics and researchers, is an excellent example of this. And that brings me to the discontinued James Randi Educational Foundation $1 Million Paranormal Challenge, the absolute pinnacle of skeptical nonsense. This isn't a superfluous claim, by the way. I did a great deal of research on the challenge. I have proof. I've encountered many skeptics over the years who bring up this challenge, and it never occurred to any of them that the challenge might have any flaws. Even the shortest internet search can bring up some of the controversy, and yet time and again, it's brought into the argument as some sort of decisive proof. The challenge, if you could even call it that, had no consistent documentation, and there was no peer review. The adjudication was Randi decided, and that was it. There was no review of previous experiments, no replication, unreasonable terms, and as I said, no adjudication of any real nature about the disputes. It required applicants to agree to an unnecessary preliminary challenge where they were presented with a take it or leave it option for competing for the money. The basic problem with the challenge was the ability of Randi to simply change the required effect size to be demonstrated until the challenge was impossible to win. Since most people don't know what effect size to expect from psychic ability, they had no way of knowing whether the challenge was fair or not. And Randi certainly knew enough about psychic ability to create an impossible challenge. I followed a thread where he changed one applicant's test at the last minute from doable to impossible. The guy's name was Pavel Zibarov, and he wisely abandoned the challenge at that point. Of course, the organization marked him as a failure because that's how they rolled. Now, imagine if you knew nothing about basketball and there was a test of ability. You had to shoot a basket 3 times in a row to win from half court. Now, you might make the argument, well, if you know how to shoot a basket, this should be easy. And no one would know enough to dispute that. And when someone complains that the challenge is too hard, they're a whiner. In fact, shooting a basketball from mid-court has odds of roughly 100 to 1. Doing this 3 times in a row would be 1 in a million. It's theoretically possible, but so unlikely as to be practically impossible. And if you didn't know how hard it was, and certainly some of the people swept up in the challenge didn't know their abilities very well, you wouldn't know that their failure was not a measure of their abilities. The tasks were simply too hard. In keeping with the basketball analogy, you can make this challenge even harder by introducing a strict time limit, rushing the applicant, claiming that the person had their toe over the line if they actually sunk a basket, disapproving judges in a hostile crowd, hoping for you to fail. The only thing that the rest of the world is going to see is that person X failed the challenge because no one pays any attention to the details. There is one particularly mean-spirited example of this, and that was the testing of psychic medium Patricia Putt. This was in 2009. She had no input on the design of the challenge. It was constructed by a couple of university professors, Chris French and Richard Weissman. Wait, those names sound familiar. Aren't those the guys that did the failed precognition experiment and then publicized the hell out of it? Yep, that's them. Putt had a take it or leave it choice. She was unaware of other experiments with mediums done under better conditions. Professor Gary Schwartz had done some simple yet elegant experiments in 2001. And Julie Beischel had done some excellent triple-blinded experiments published in 2008. Both of those studies were careful to maintain the flow of an ordinary reading while instituting proper controls. The Weissman French experiment was crude and clumsy by comparison. Putt had to give 10 readings in one day by writing them out on paper. As a professional medium, her normal sessions were conducted by talking, and she never did more than 3 to 5 readings in a day. So the professors were insisting on a process that not only was completely unnatural to her, but overworked her as well. As there were 10 readings, she was somewhat rushed, and of course her hands started cramping from all the writing. I suppose there are worse ways to test a medium, but they don't come to mind. One moment. There were other, more technical reasons that this challenge attempt was designed for failure, but this was probably enough on its own to ensure that this happened. Both of these professors were involved in parapsychology enough to probably know that she was going to fail, so it's not really even all that surprising that this is what happened. The worst part of this was the negative publicity that followed, which, in my opinion, demonstrated the true nature of this rigged experiment and the paranormal challenge in general. Public humiliation. Chris French, in fact, wrote an article for The Guardian explaining how great the experiment was and that Patricia Putt had failed it miserably. I'm not saying that this was unethical, but on the other hand, I'm never doing a trust fall with these guys. Skeptics usually get a pass on being scrutinized, and that's what happened here. There were no discussions about whether this was a good experiment or not. All that mattered was that she failed the challenge. It was only years later that I looked into it, and I could only do that because it was one of the rare challenge attempts that actually documented, sort of, what happened. There were a few things that couldn't be followed up on. The lure of the $1 Million Challenge is that it appeals to the worst instincts of skeptics. No one has passed the challenge. It's an easy statement to make, and from there they segue to the claim that if psychic ability were real, then someone would have passed the challenge. From my perspective, it sure makes it easy to size up a skeptic. If they mention the challenge as any sort of proof of anything, it's an almost absolute certainty that they have done exactly zero research into the credibility of the challenge and that they're kind of clueless about how this whole science thing works. Any discussion with them is going to turn into a Roadrunner cartoon where they play Wile E. Coyote, always losing, never giving up, and always acting each time like nothing happened. So who are the skeptics? Well, there tends to be a sameness of individuals demographically. In the case of skeptics, they skew towards younger, white, Western-educated males with at least a college degree, and frequently an advanced degree, usually in sciences that deal in the material. Some psychologists have tested the theory that skeptics are somehow smarter, but the differences they found between believers and skeptics was minor, with skeptics slightly edging out believers in some tasks. Interestingly, though, when skeptics and practitioners were compared, even that difference went away. Skeptics, apparently, are not smarter than the rest of us, and we're not smarter than them. The skeptic community is an offshoot of atheism. No surprise there. The Committee for Skeptical Investigations shares office space with the Council for Secular Humanism, and sometimes they even share executives. A 2013 study found that there are actually 6 different types of atheism: academic, activist, agnostic, anti-theist, non-theist, and ritual atheist. The category we're interested in here would be the anti-theists, a group defined by their opposition to religion. Skeptics frequently bash religion, so they appear to belong to the anti-theist category. Anti-theists appear to be the fundamentalists of atheism. That's a label that would surely anger them. But they perceive their idea of atheism to be the true version of it. And just like the fundamentalists of some other religion, they don't perceive atheism to be a range of beliefs. Rather, they take pride in viewing it as a single monolithic rejection of the sky daddy. They can be quite intolerant. For them, atheism is something to be promoted and defended. Skeptics believe that they are on a crusade to battle superstitious beliefs and protect science from irrationality. That kind of adds to the whole religious zealot vibe, doesn't it? You can see their need for science to be perfect with subjects like evolution. Point out that it has some flaws, and you can expect to be branded as a creationist by them. They are not comfortable with having any uncertainty. They're perfectly okay with incremental change, but they are deeply uncomfortable when challenged with paradigm-shifting ideas. Parapsychology is absolutely paradigm changing. It throws an awful lot of their assumptions about science out the window, down the street, and over the cliff. And that's partly why they have such a strong aversion to it. If psychic ability is accepted, they will not be left with the science that they recognize. They have a strong need to explain away or otherwise bury healthy controversies that are often indicative that evidence is accumulating for ideas that skeptics have rejected. Now, before I go any further, let me add my disclaimer here. Skeptics are people, and people are complicated. And I'm putting skeptics in a very particular box, and I'm putting a pretty bow on it, but this is in a general way. My investigation of various skeptics, when that was possible, indicated that it's a bit of a spectrum. Individuals are going to vary somewhat in the degree in which they adopt skeptical values, attitudes, ideas, and beliefs. Now that I have that out of the way, my personal opinion is that what separates skeptics most from believers and practitioners is that skeptics have a very poor tolerance for ambiguity. And that ability to tolerate ambiguity is a holistic thing. It's not hard to see that trait in skeptics. They're very fond of phrases like, there is no evidence, and there's never been a successful experiment, and of course, they throw out the term pseudoscience. What you never hear them say is, there is some evidence for psi. There have been some successful experiments, and I'm not quite convinced. Everything is very black and white, which is not very holistic. Holistic thinking can be kind of hard to wrap your head around. The best way to explain it is that logical thinking is good for figuring out how to win a battle. Holistic thinking is about trying to figure out whether to fight that battle at all. To win a battle, you're looking at the tangible, your strength, the enemy's strength, the terrain, and known variables. To decide whether to fight, you have to look at intangibles. Does this meet my goals? Will this have the desired effect? Will the reward from this undertaking be worth it? All of these things have a lot of ambiguity about them, and most of the time, there's no obviously right answer. That's holistic thinking. Skeptics want psychic ability to be easy to understand. They want it to make sense to them and to be easily observable. But it isn't any of those things. There isn't one easy, definitive way to reliably show the existence of psychic ability that everyone can do. It isn't straightforward. Psychics get some stuff wrong and some stuff right, and they can't tell which is which. Nevertheless, over time, they give meaningful and useful information to people. Some are better than others, but it can be hard to quantify which. Customers of psychics generally know how to process the stream of information that they receive, and they understand how to get value out of it. Now, paranormal events will pop up out of nowhere, and they can go away just as quickly. They are difficult to document, and even for people who have experienced them directly, they aren't always easy to understand. Pick almost any individual paranormal event, and there will be a certain amount of uncertainty and ambiguity. Skeptics don't understand this, so they think it's all fake. And I think that's the most important point. If psi is accepted as real, understanding the science will be beyond their grasp. It will require thinking abilities that the skeptics don't possess. It's no coincidence that skeptics attack a wide range of holistic approaches to medicine. They disbelieve Reiki, homeopathy, acupuncture, acupressure, naturopathy, aromatherapy, fasting, macrobiotic diets, reflexology, traditional Chinese medicine, and even, for God's sakes, chiropractic care. The list is actually much longer than this. You can check out the whole enchilada on Wikipedia, which is an excellent source of skeptical bias. Any theory involving consciousness and physics is also verboten. For people who describe themselves by their supposed non-belief, they sure need to believe a lot of stuff. The ability to think in terms of a whole, to grasp concepts abstractly from ambiguous information, and to not have to constantly look at the pieces is crucial for recognizing your own cognitive dissonance. Holistic thinking is the thing that takes you a step back, shows you that you're reacting emotionally to a fact, and that you don't want to accept it. It sounds easy enough, but if you add in some fear, ego, and plain stubbornness, changing your mind can become incredibly difficult. Now that you know something about the nature of parapsychological skepticism, let's move on to what they do and how that affects society. We have two distinct things to look at: the organizations that the skeptics create and the organizations that they influence and change. The Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, which I mentioned earlier, has as their main purpose public relations, and they also evangelize skeptical beliefs. They rely on professors, scientists, and media types with strong skeptical views to offer commentary to mainstream media anytime psychics, parapsychological research, or other consciousness research gets taken seriously. They have perfected the pseudo-balanced viewpoint designed to discredit. Outwardly, it looks like they're examining various subjects carefully, but they always reach the same conclusions, which makes this nothing more than propaganda. Skeptics in general love their idea of science, and some of them have become science editors for various media publications. This is a typical thing for an authoritarian to do. They seek positions of power and influence because that's part of their personality. And in turn, they end up using these positions to squash dissent. It's not a grand conspiracy of mainstream media, even if it might look like that to some people. It's just a natural outcome of people being people. Skeptics have authoritarian traits. Those traits lead them to seek positions of authority, and then they use that authority to their own ends. Skeptics are into science, so you're going to see authoritarian skeptic science editors. And then you have academia, and that is structurally authoritarian. It's characterized by an overemphasis on the status quo, protecting the interests of the powerful, and exploiting the most vulnerable. This is especially common in the hard sciences, where newcomers have to toil for years in the shadow of their seniors before becoming an elite. And like other authoritarian systems, it's enormously resistant to reform. It's a process practically designed to weed out any creative or unconventional thinkers. In such a system, you can expect skeptics and their authoritarian traits to thrive. These are the types of people that can relate to an academic system. And it's just another way in which people being people creates an undesirable outcome. Wikipedia is a bit different because it's a captured system, and it has slowly been bent to the will of authoritarian personality types. It's a platform that rewards hard-headed people who value power and control over compromise. Because they are anonymous on that platform, they are generally free from the ordinary social consequences of bad behavior, and it shows. It's been well documented that Wikipedia shifted some years ago from being inclusionist to a more authoritarian stance of being exclusionist. And with that have come the predictable problems associated with authoritarians. Misogyny, a decline in editor participation, where more is being done by an ever smaller group, and a tendency to exclude anyone who can challenge their authority so that not even topic experts can get past the editors is part of what happens. Knowledge and expertise are secondary to power and control on Wikipedia. And it makes editing very inefficient and a futile process for anyone except the in crowd. When it comes to subjects like parapsychology and holistic medical practices mentioned earlier, Wikipedia has been totally gamed by the skeptics to produce some very biased and inaccurate articles. There's a Wikipedia editing group known as the Guerrilla Skeptics. I don't know the full scope of what they do, but I've seen their blog and also a training video, and they seem to be responsible for the worst of the biased editing on parapsychology-related topics on Wikipedia. To do this, they rely on the usual cherry picking and omissions, but also sketchy skeptical websites such as the Skeptic's Dictionary, articles from the Skeptical Inquirer, Rational Wiki, What's the Harm, and Quackwatch, to name a few. These in turn are used as sources on Wikipedia, which boosts their Google rankings and general respectability, which in turn makes their use on Wikipedia more justifiable. When people try to correct the many problems found on skeptical Wikipedia articles, they either give up quickly or they're banned. In some cases, they get defamatory biographies on Rational Wiki. If the person is relatively unknown, that's the first thing people will see if they do a search of their name. My personal experience in dealing with Wikipedia editors was that they launched into bullying me almost immediately, and they did the same to pretty much anyone who tried to correct articles. They never let up. And there's no adult supervision on Wikipedia to stop them. I found them to be the most disagreeable skeptics I've ever encountered, and that's saying something. Perhaps the worst part of this is that Wikipedia has been shown to have an effect on the sciences. And considering how hard it is for actual scholars to edit it, that's a little scary. Knowledge searches display Wikipedia results at every turn, so this is really an important way in which public opinion is being influenced. So all of these things, skeptical public relations, skeptics in the mainstream media and academia, and skeptics on Wikipedia, create a situation where a very particular and narrow worldview is having an outsized impact on what people learn and how they contextualize it. They are training people to have an idealistic and imaginary view of what science is, and they are subtly conveying a materialistic, atheistic worldview in the process. I'm not saying that they're in total control. There isn't some vast conspiracy planned and executed by an all-powerful skeptical Illuminati. Rather, it's just a collection of people who have a loose coalition that creates a great deal of noise. There are many issues that make skeptical zealotry a problem, besides the usual gumming up of scientific discovery, discouraging research, bashing psychics, and slandering researchers. A lot of people have psychic experiences, and they are almost entirely ignorant of the science of psychic ability. This understandably causes them problems. In healthcare, psychic experiences can be mistaken for psychosis with disastrous consequences. People can become unnecessarily frightened by their psychic abilities and require therapy just because important information has been withheld from them. Psychologist Jim Carpenter has noted that many people he's worked with just needed to know that psychic ability was real and that they weren't going crazy. That was enough for them. On a Q&A website that I use frequently, it's called Quora, I've seen many comments from people who concluded that psychic ability was real, but that it was beyond the realm of science to test for it. I'm sure this is a consequence that skeptics hadn't anticipated. By working to suppress psi research, skeptics have unwittingly caused people to make a false choice between science and what they know to be real. This can cause people to reject science since it obviously doesn't describe reality. And this creates exactly the opposite effect of what the skeptics intended. It was my goal in this talk to help others see what becomes obvious if you engage with skeptics enough. They are no different from anyone else who's out there defending their specific beliefs with missionary zeal. They're not listening. They're not even slightly interested in anything that would challenge their beliefs. We should be treating them like we treat everyone else who acts like that. We let them have their say, and then we move on to a more rational discussion with someone else. They have not earned the right to be taken seriously. Seeing the skeptics in this light also helps inform us about what to do about them. Convincing the skeptics is not a worthy goal because that's never ever going to happen. Gathering more evidence is not necessary because there's already way more than enough. And skeptics won't acknowledge that anyway. Arguing with skeptics is not useful since they can just make stuff up or just never give you any credibility. That's never going to end. The skeptics have to be overwhelmed to the point that they're the ones with the problem, and being a skeptic has to be seen as belonging to the lunatic fringe. It's not a science problem, it's a culture war, and it can only be dealt with in that manner. We live during a time when most people are sick to death of authoritarian behavior, and since skeptics can't help but behave that way, I think parapsychology has a chance to gain a little ground. There is nothing wrong with having these people in the world. We just need to put their opinions in the proper context. We don't let creationists take over discussions of evolution. We don't let flat earthers take over astronomy. And we shouldn't let materialist atheists take over discussions of parapsychology, a science with obvious spiritual implications. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. That was quite wonderful. I was absolutely riveted.